So at this point, we've got our knife all roughed out, and we can see that I've covered it in this bluish purpley colored stuff that's called dicam. And it's basically just a layout fluid. So now I've got a drill bit that's the same thickness as the piece of metal I'm working with. And what I'm doing is I'm using that drill bit to scribe a line right down the middle of the blade, so that when I begin grinding the bevels, I can see where I should be stopping to keep both sides even. So we've got a center line of the sharp edge coming right down the middle of the knife there. So we're going to start grinding the bevels now, and I start with a really heavy grit belt, and this is actually an old belt. It's not something that I'll stick with long, but when you first start on the metal, you've got a real sharp edge there, and if you use a good brand new belt on there, it just tends to chew it up. So you just take that original like 45 degrees off of the corner, start to establish a nice flat, and then we'll switch to a little bit better belt, and we'll really focus in on starting to grind the bevel. So at this point, we're using about a 60 grit belt, so it's still a pretty heavy grit, and we're just trying to remove a lot of the meat. And so you can see that you sort of establish the flat, and you really just kind of have to go by feel. This is always tricky for me. I feel like this is the hardest part, and chef knives are actually really hard. The blade is so long and so thin, it just flexes all over the place. So we can see at this point we're starting to make some good progress chasing up the knife here. Um, with the chef, I tend to work in smaller areas. Usually smaller knives, you try and be real consistent with pulling it across the belt, but these things are so long and so flexible that I just tend to work, the knife almost in thirds, work in small pieces back and forth, and then you just try and blend the sections together and even out that grind line. But if you try it, anytime I try and just take it straight across all the way, um, the knife flexes and the grind isn't consistent. Lots of time and lots of passes later, we're switching to our final belt. I had started with a 60. Well, I started with a 36 originally, then we switched to a 60 for the majority of the grinding, and then an 80, and now we're finishing up to the very top of the blade here with 120. Remove a lot of the heavier scratches so that when we get to the hand sanding steps, that we don't have as much work ahead of us. So we're just going to sort of smooth a lot of those scratches out, and we'll be ready to move on to the next step. So our grinding's done. It's time for us to put some holes in the handle. So I'm starting with something called a center bit. And basically a center bit, it's used for a number of things, a lot of times on mills and lathes. It works great here for basically starting the holes. It doesn't flex and it doesn't wander, so you can get the holes located right exactly where you want them. If you go deeper, it'll also countersink and do stuff like that, but I'm just using that bit just to get the hole started perfectly on the line. If you start right with a drill bit, it tends to wander and flex and it skates away from the mark where you actually want it. So this is a good place to start, and then we'll go back with our drill bit in a second. All right, it's time for us to drill some holes now. We've got our pilot started. I'm going to use some cutting fluid here, try and help keep some of the heat down, help these bits to last longer, cut better. Unfortunately, my drill press doesn't quite go slow enough. I got all the belts set up to the slowest speed, and they do okay with this smaller stuff. But when I start switching to larger bits, it's still a little too fast. I don't have a bench top mill or anything that I could do this on. So I have to start with small bits and move up to the large. And even with these things, because of the heat generated in this metal, this 15N20, I just can't get through it with regular bits. It just gets hot and it work hardens and it just gets so hard that the drill bits won't go through. But these cobalt ones do pretty well, especially if I start with small bits and move to larger sizes. So at this point, we're just going to keep switching out the drill bits and going larger and larger so that we get the appropriately sized holes, ranging in size that will work with the design for this. For the last step here, this is just to sort of clean up those holes. We can see that it kind of cuts through pretty ugly. We see some raised edges, and this is called chamfering. And we're basically putting a little beveled edge across there. Um, It'll help everything sit together a lot better. We've got little slightly oversized holes. I like to see it as the epoxy will also go through here, and it gives it a place to lock into. But I like to say that my knives look nice on the outside and on the inside too. So this will really clean it up and make it all come together a lot nicer.